Well, Congressman, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I was just in Houston last week covering a lot of Democratic presidential candidates who were there campaigning. Do you think Texas is a battleground state now?
They're certainly trying to make it a battleground state. I would have worried about, I would say, the older Democratic Party before now. The new Democratic Party, I'm not as worried about. When you're talking about a Green New Deal in Houston, Texas, I think that's a losing argument. When you're talking about Medicare for All in Houston, Texas, home of Texas Medical Center, I think that's a losing argument because these things would cost hundreds of thousands of jobs. It would cost the Texas Medical Center to lose funding. It would cause hospitals to close, doctors to quit their jobs. None of these things are good for Houston, so I'd be very surprised if these messages were actually resonating in Texas.
You mentioned the Green New Deal. You are a younger member of Congress. Climate change is an issue that ranks really high among the concerns of younger people. Do you think Republicans, while they don't support the Green New Deal, obviously, do you think they need to come up with some kind of counter to it or some kind of proposal to address climate change? And are you concerned that Republicans aren't addressing it and therefore losing out on a really important constituency?
This is a big conversation in the Republican Party right now, and actually a lot of those proposals are really starting to bubble up to the surface. And it really centers around one fundamental idea. You can't solve the emissions problem by kneecapping the greatest innovator the world has ever known, which is the United States of America. You have to solve it by providing new innovative technologies to the world. Okay, that is the role of the United States. Because let's look at what has worked and what hasn't worked. So what has worked is the fact that we've decreased emissions by 14% since the year 2000. How do we do that? Well, it was actually through natural gas revolution and new technologies that makes our energy use more efficient. That's how we've done that. Look at Germany. Germany spent $580 billion moving to wind and solar, and emissions per capita are basically flat. These things aren't working. So we need to be looking at new technology like nuclear, carbon capture technologies, and exporting natural gas, clean natural gas, to coal-burning countries. That would actually help the entire globe instead of just kneecapping the greatest economy that the world has ever known.
But when the president tweets, kind of anytime there's a big climate-related event that, kind of denying that humans are having an impact on climate change, what kind of message does that send? And should Republicans have something to say, well, here's what we have. Here's our version of some kind of Green New Deal.
Yeah, I'm not sure what tweet you're referring to. Is it?
Well, when there's a snowstorm or when there's some big.
And he'll say, "Oh, what about climate change?
Exactly.
What about global warming?" I mean, I think we can assume he's joking there because he's clearly being sarcastic. But that aside, the president is on board with a lot of these proposals as well that are coming to the surface. And we have to be the party that proposes reasonable, realistic solutions to lowering emissions, and that's exactly what we're doing.
I want to talk a little bit about some news items of the day. The Mueller report. Obviously, Barr was on Capitol Hill this week testifying. Do you think that Mueller should come in front of the various committees and testify as well?
Well, I wouldn't mind hearing from him. And I have a feeling this is what he's going to say. He's going to say that everything I have to say is in that report that you now have. All right, and it's all out there, so we can argue about the nuance and a lot of all the craziness that we saw just yesterday with Attorney General Barr. But the reality is that we have all the facts. They're out there. The president didn't collude. He didn't coordinate. All right, and there's definitely not enough evidence to charge him with a crime on obstruction. Obstruction, by the way, of a crime that never happened. So let's be clear about that. So, let's hear from Mueller. Be happy to.
The underlying part of that report, though, was that Russians meddled in the 2016 election. Are you concerned that they're doing it again in 2020? And do you think the administration's response to it is adequate? Do you think they need to be doing more to respond to that?
Yeah. I was concerned about Russian meddling in the decades prior to 2016, and I'm going to be concerned about it for as long as Russia exists. All right, this is what they do. They've been doing it for a long time. We definitely didn't do enough about it in 2016. That's actually a pretty concerning thing, that we knew about this and there was no steps taken. In fact, the only steps taken were to look into the Trump campaign, which I think is a little odd. We always need to do more on cyber security, especially defense. Okay, we're great at cyber offense. We are not so great at cyber defense, and it's hard. We're a free society. We're a free economy. What the Russians did was effectively set up an operation that was, I would say, a super PAC light. All right, they funded a bunch of ads that were hard to trace back to foreign entities until looking at it after the fact. We have to do a better job looking into that. And I think this administration is. There's no indication that they aren't taking it seriously. There's no indication that our national security agencies are not taking this seriously. But we should continue to push them to do so and make sure that there's proper oversight of it.
Another item in the news, this vote on Yemen, specifically the Senate not being able to override the presidential veto. They don't want to send aid to Yemen. The president does. You voted against that measure. Why?
Well, because fundamentally it's about countering Iran. All right, there is no perfect conflict in the Middle East that is clear cut on what the United States should do, but the reality is our troops are not fighting there, so it's not clear that you could even argue we have troops on the ground, and fundamentally Iran is a threat. It's a threat to Israel. It's a threat to the world. This regime has long been pursuing destabilization throughout that region, and this is the case in Yemen as well. And we have allies in Oman next to Yemen and in Saudi Arabia, and we should be pretty concerned about that being overthrown by an Iran-friendly government, which would be the Houthi rebels in this case.
But what was really interesting about the debate, because it did really expose a real divide among Republicans and the president, and specifically they wanted to, or many Republicans wanted to send this message to the president about his stance towards Saudi Arabia. Are you concerned at all about his approach?
On our alliance with Saudi Arabia in general, nothing is perfect in the Middle East, like I said before. So they are not perfect allies. They don't operate their country the way we would like them to. They have a bad record on human rights. I understand all that. But Iran is worse. Iran is worst. And Saudi Arabia has proven to be a decent ally in some ways as well, even when countering Sunni extremism, which but you could also argue that developed from Wahhabi Islam within Saudi Arabia. So I realize this is a nuanced conversation, but in the end, they are better allies than they are not, and we should be supporting them, especially when it's countering what is a true threat, which is the Iranian regime.
Venezuela. You have a connection to South America. You went to high school in Colombia, but your parents lived in Caracas, as I understand it.
They did.
What do you make of the administration's approach? There's been a lot of talk, obviously, support for regime change, but what does that look like? Would you support military force, for example?
We're not at the point yet where we should have American troops on the ground. You don't ever want to rule anything out, because all that would do is embolden the Maduro regime. But we're not there yet. All right, we want this to be organic from the Venezuelan people, and that's what we're seeing right now. It's going to be a fight. A fight for freedom is never easy, but that's what's happening right now. And I think we should be very proud to stand behind Juan Guaido and the people following him, which is a lot. I mean, you see what's happening there. Hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets demanding their freedom, demanding regime change. This regime has completely destroyed this incredibly wealthy, prosperous country. Again, I've been there many times. It's so different now, and that's so unfortunate. There's so many Venezuelans who live in the United States, who I talk to every day. There's a lot in Houston. And it's devistating to them to see what's happened to their country. They want this regime change to happen, and we should continue to support it. It doesn't have to be military boots on the ground. It can be vocal support, moral support, economic support, and there's a whole of government approach that we can take that doesn't involve military troops.
What would it take to get to the point where military force would have to be the option, and would you want Congress to have some kind of buy-in if they were to go that route?
Yeah, Congress should certainly have buy-in there. It's hard to answer hypotheticals. You're taking this on a day-by-day basis, but you could imagine genocide being a pretty good indicator that something has to be done. But even then, is it really American troops that should be doing it? There's other leaders in the region, the Colombians, the Brazilians. They want to be bigger leaders in South America, and we should encourage that. And it's hard to say until the situation's actually happening.
I want to ask you about a couple veterans issues. As a veteran, your freshman colleague, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, has said that the VA is doing good work, it just needs more funding. Do you believe that? In terms of healthcare, I should say.
They are doing good work, but they're far from perfect. I think her comment was, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, okay, so it needs no fixing, is her assertion. That's fundamentally untrue. She's never gotten care at the VA. I have. All VAs are different. If this was a simple thing to fix, Congress would probably fix it, because there is no partisan dispute on getting veterans better health care. but it's complex, and every VA is different. Every VA has different problems. They're all operating within massive bureaucracies. And I talked to the administrators down in Houston, and what they want, they just want consistent funding that they can predict, and then they want the freedom to give that health care to veterans, meaning they don't want to operate in this massive bureaucracy that is really centered in Washington. You give people some trust and some flexibility to help veterans, they'll generally do the right thing. We've taken some steps towards that, for instance, making it easier to hire and fire people. In the federal government, this is actually a huge problem. Okay, and private industry doesn't understand this because they can always just say, hey, you're not doing your job, you're fired. You can't do that in federal government. So we made it easier, at least in the VA, to be able to do that. So there's certain steps being taken.
Any other kind of fixes that you think are achievable in a divided government when it comes to the VA? Because you're right, it is such a bipartisan issue.
Right.
It's just about how to go about it.
Well, in the last session, they passed the VA Mission Act. Now that has to be implemented. So we need to watch how that's implemented, make sure it's implemented correctly. And basically what this does, it does a variety of things, but one thing it does is it streamlines the ability of veterans to get private care when they don't feel like they're getting it on time or efficiently from the VA itself. Because a lot of times the VA is overwhelmed, and it makes sense to allow veterans to go to outside care, go to somebody they trust. Younger veterans tend to like that more. All right, younger veterans you talk to, my age, will tend to want simply an insurance card, and they say, why can't I have that? Older veterans don't. Okay, they want that community feeling at the VA, and that's going to be a conversation among veterans, I think, for the decades to come.
Another one of your freshman colleagues, Ilhan Omar, you've been very critical of her in a video in which she appeared to say that some people did some bad things on September 11th. You have come under criticism, though, for that video not telling the entire story, taken out of context. Do you have any regrets about that criticism?
No, and there's no indication that it was ever taken out of context. The broader point that she was making is perfectly fine. The broader point she was making was that that organization CARE defends civil liberties, and that there was a concern about civil liberties post 9/11. That doesn't change the fact that you refer to 9/11 in a dismissive way, both in tone and in gesture and in words, as some people did something. All right. All I said was that's unbelievable that you would refer to it that way, and I stand by that wholeheartedly. There's no extra context there. To say it was taken out of context would infer that she meant something else, that she didn't mean 9/11 when she said some people did something, but clearly we know she did. So
she has said that she's gotten a lot of death threats. I mean, are you concerned about that?
You should always be concerned about death threats. I get death threats. Unfortunately, it's part of the nature of this job. But anybody who would ever threaten a member of Congress should, is a horrible human being. Enough said about that, and we should always be concerned about that. But it is not anybody else's words that caused these things. It is her words, okay? And you can't lay that blame on anybody else.